Okay, please take out your Bibles, open them up to the book of Matthew. We are in the Gospel of Matthew, so it's not going to be in those little journals we've been using. The Gospel of Matthew, and we are going to be reading in chapter 28. I am going to read verses 1 through 15 this morning. Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 15. This is what it says. I'm going to give you another second to turn. I still hear paper turning, and that's wonderful. Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 15. Matthew writes this. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, that's Sunday, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly and ran from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell the people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this is the story, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. How do you capture the glory of a morning like this? How do you do it justice? You know, we come and we sing songs and we say, "Praise the Lord," and we do these things. How do we really capture it? I wish there was some way we could really just get a hold of the joy and the power and the glory of this day. Maybe a giant orchestra and fireworks and lights and all this we could do to try and celebrate it. And I don't mean little fireworks like you do at home in your driveway. I mean colossal fireworks. This is an idea I'm kind of working with for Easter morning, right? I mean, just remember the year after they stopped the shutdown, the 4th of July came, and that first year during shutdown, and nobody could have the fireworks displays. And the next year, everybody lit off 2 years worth, and they did it all in 5 minutes. That's what I'm talking about. Make the ground rumble because of just trying to capture the excitement of everything that happened on that morning. We used to, when I was a kid, the church I went to, we had what was called a sunrise service on Easter morning. How many of you remember those? It's not something we like to get up and do anymore. No, we'd go to this peaceful place just as the sun was coming out and it was freezing cold, and we would gather and we would say a couple nice things about the resurrection, and that was wonderful. But I'm wanting something, maybe a sunrise service with the William Tell Overture playing or something and fireworks going off right over here. How do you think the neighbors would like that? It's Easter morning, right? Who cares? They would surely know we were having church. We have some wonderful songs and stuff like that, but I don't know it's so hard to really capture the excitement of the morning when Jesus walked out of the tomb. God apparently felt the same way. It says he launched it off. He kicked it off with an earthquake. That was the second earthquake they'd had in a week. They had one Friday, and they had one on Sunday, too, which, honestly, the darkness and the earthquakes are both recorded by historians who were not Christians at that time. Did you know that? Absolutely. He launched it with an earthquake. Not just an earthquake, it says, but a great earthquake. I know my wife thinks I'm a little off. Well, she probably might think I'm more than a little off, but it's one of those things I've wanted to experience. She goes to California all the time. It's like, I want to experience an earthquake. I want to feel it, see the ground heaving and survive probably, I don't know why, but I do. Not a Michigan earthquake. I've experienced one of those, and an Indiana earthquake. I mean, a real earthquake. This was a real earthquake. And then, as soon as this earthquake hit, his glorious angel swoops down out of heaven and rolls the stone away and sits on the thing. And this is a big stone. It probably took several men to put this stone in place. And this angel comes down like lightning. It even says that his appearance was like lightning. Have you ever seen lightning strike something close to you? I remember a day my mom and I and my dad, we were sitting there when I was still at home, and we were watching TV, and just outside the window there was a giant tree, and it got struck by lightning, and it just blasted it into oblivion. And it was like, I couldn't see anything for a while. That was so cool. That's what it was like when this angel came down. This was no little cherub baby fluttering down on these little wings. Big fat baby little wings. This was a powerful being. It says his appearance was as lightning and his clothing was white as snow, like when you step out on one of those winter mornings and you just can't see yet. And this is all happening, it says, just as it was about to become daylight. It was just before the dawn. It was still kind of dark. And here this glorious light comes down. The earth is shaking and this angel pushes aside the stone and sits on it. What did the soldiers do when this happened? Look at it. What did they do? It says, and for fear of him, this angel, they became like what? Dead men. They became like dead men. And mind you, these weren't rent-a-cops. Okay? This wasn't the security officer who works at your company at night. These were Roman soldiers, the biggest, baddest army in the world, maybe ever. And they became like dead men, battle-hardened men. The ground was shaking. Their bodies were shaking and convulsing, and they were paralyzed. They were catatonic, frozen. I suspect a few of them may, if not all of them, might have even needed to go and change their tunics and clean up a little bit after this happened. Everything just let go. But why wouldn't they react this way? His appearance was as lightning. This angel, who was like the one I told you about last week, came in one night and killed 185,000 of the most powerful army in the world at that time, in one night. And here was one standing before him. And he probably the angel I'm sure was pretty glad to be there, because 3 days earlier he wanted to be there when they were beating Jesus, and now he was there. I want you to notice something that happened in all of that. Do you notice that it doesn't say that Jesus stepped out of the tomb? The angel rolled away the stone. Does it say anything about Jesus stepping out? No. You know why? He wasn't there. You got it. He wasn't there. He was gone. He had raised. He was not there anymore. The stone was not rolled away to let Jesus out. It was rolled away to let us in. The ladies were coming to see the grave, and the angel rolls it away and says, look, he's not here. Take a look. That is exactly what he says in verses 5 and 6. Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. Present tense. He has risen. Past tense. Sometime during the night, Jesus got up, he folded up the cloths in there, and he laid them on the thing, and we know from other stories that at that time Jesus was able to walk through walls, and he just walked right out, soldiers and all. And the angel says to them, come see the place where he lay. He's not here. Come look. That's the kind of morning it was. It just quickly turned into, from this quiet morning and the sun just coming up, into this great cacophony of noise and activity and running back and forth and shouting and talking and hustling and bustling. Everybody's running everywhere because he's not there. Have you ever read all four of the accounts of the resurrection and tried to reconcile them? There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and what's the other one? I figured you knew. I just want to see. Give you a chance to answer out. Yes. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all, if there's one event that they all record, it's this one. And yet you take all four of them and you lay them side to side, and it's kind of hard to piece together how exactly what happened in what order and all of that. It can be kind of confusing. It can be put together, but it can be confusing. You have all these different, and the reason is this: it doesn't mean that that's false. It doesn't mean that they're making stuff up. It actually tells us just the opposite, because you have these four different people telling you what they saw and what happened, and everyone's scrambling around, and because Jesus is not in the tomb, and through that hustle and the bustle, nobody's really paying close attention to what's going on. It all does line up. It can be reconciled. It just takes some work. Because it's not like, they were sitting there soaking it all in. This is a beautiful resurrection morning. That's how we approach it. They were running all over the place trying to find Jesus. Running and hustling and trying to figure out what happened to his body. And the big question was, where is Jesus? It's like a wedding. How many of you have been to a wedding and it's like that? You know how crazy it gets when everything gets rolling? Everything seems fine, and now it's time to start the wedding, and everything just goes crazy, and the limo's not here, and the flowers aren't right, and one of the kids just found the cake, and I don't want to tell you what he did to it, and all this is going on, and you're running around through the whole wedding time. You know who gets to sit there and soak it in? The guests. If you're involved in the wedding, you're going crazy, and at the end of the day, you sit down when everything is said and done, and you sit there and go, whew, what just happened? That's the kind of a morning they had when Jesus rose from the dead. It's the kind of day the first Easter Sunday was. If anything, the confusion in trying to read all of these four accounts together adds to its authenticity. If the police pull you together and you and your friends were out doing something you shouldn't have done, Gary, probably, and they pull you and they put you in different rooms and they want to hear you tell your account of what happened, and you all say the exact same thing, what does that cop think? Do you think you're telling the truth, or does he think you've collaborated on it? He believes you more if your stories aren't exactly the same. Otherwise, he thinks you sat down and you talked about it and you wrote these things out. That's exactly one of the proofs that this is so real, is that they didn't. They just told you what they heard and saw and felt that day. You have four different sources telling you their personal experience, so of course it takes some work to line it all up. But you know what? It wasn't just the followers of Jesus who were responding that way, who were running around like crazy. Look at verse 11. Verse 11 says, while these two ladies were running back to tell the apostles what had happened, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. They went and they ran into the temple, some of them. Notice it's not all of them. You see the pictures of the tomb being guarded, and they always show how many Roman soldiers. Have you ever noticed this? 2. There were at least 4. Okay, there were some of the guard, it says here. They at least had 4 there, 1 for each watch of the night. There were 4 watches in the night, and they knew they would have to be there. You know that thing about they said they fell asleep? If you were a Roman soldier, you didn't want to say, we fell asleep, and they came and took it. No, you didn't say that. There were at least 4, and it says some of them went, so that means at least 2 went, and some of them stayed. I don't know if they looked and saw who had the cleanest tunics or what, or who came back to their consciousness first, but when the ladies ran off, these guards ran off, and they told the religious leaders who had just crucified Jesus everything that just happened. The religious leaders were really scared. It says the chief priests assembled the elders to take counsel. They were all still in bed. I don't know that they were sleeping well, because they knew that Jesus said he was coming back in 3 days, and they're laying there in bed just at sunrise, and all of a sudden on their door, there's, let us in, let us in. He's gone. This angel came. He came down. We saw this. We were all scared to death. And he opened the tomb, and Jesus wasn't in there. Religious leaders knew this was coming. It is one of the most marvelous things as you read this story, that as soon as these religious leaders heard that this had happened and Jesus was gone, the ones who crucified him knew it was true. And his disciples didn't believe it. Flip back with me, turn with me back one, probably page, to Matthew 27, 62 through 66. It shows us that the religious leaders knew this was coming. Matthew 27, 62 through 66. This is right after the crucifixion. It says, the next day, so the morning after the crucifixion, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that this impostor said while he was still alive, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest the disciples go and steal him away and tell all the people he has risen from the dead, and that last fraud will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it secure as you can. So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard on it. That sealing the stone, he put the governor's stamp on that stone. Nobody touches this by order of the Roman government. And he put soldiers in front of it because the religious leaders knew Jesus had said, You're going to kill me, and in 3 days I'll be back. What a great sign that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be and who we believed. Anybody who can say, You're going to kill me, and I'm going to be in the ground 3 days and 3 nights, and I will be back at the end of that of my own power, you better listen to what he's saying. They believed it, that he had said it, and so they wanted the tomb sealed for at least 3 days. I find it interesting, too, in those verses there, when they addressed him, they addressed Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who was a terribly wicked man. And it says, they said to him, Sir. Well, it says that in the English. In the Greek, it uses the same word as Lord. When we say Jesus is Lord, the Greek word is the same thing. They said to him, Lord. These men who hated and despised this Roman ruler were ready now to kowtow before him to get his help because they were afraid Jesus was coming back in 3 days. Who would dare to defy something sealed by the power of Rome and guarded by its soldiers? But you know what? It wasn't enough to keep Jesus down. The body of Jesus was gone. Both sides were running around in this frenzy, both sides asking the same question, running around, and the question is, where is Jesus? How do you capture the glory of a moment like that? How do you capture the impact of what happened that day? I mean, you might find this surprising, but it wasn't like everyone was all of a sudden, they all looked and said, hey, you can take a tour, you can come visit the empty tomb, and you can see that Jesus' body isn't there. He's raised from the dead, just like he said he would. It wasn't like everybody believed. Like I told you, the disciples didn't. I think the women believed first. That seems to happen a lot. And you look through the church history, a lot of times, I don't know why it wasn't the men who were there at the tomb that morning. He said, I'll be back in 3 days. Where were they? Hiding. The women, it says, believed right away. And they ran and told the disciples about it. But you know, they were women. What do they know? Now, before you throw stuff, I'm not saying that of my opinion. I'm not talking from my perspective, but it was theirs. Did you know in the first century, a woman could not even testify in court? A woman's testimony could not be accepted in court. So if the authors were making this up, why would they say the women were the ones who found him and came and told everybody? It's another one of those slight evidences that lends itself to the reality of what they're saying. They're just telling what actually happened. Luke tells us that the women came and told the disciples what they had seen, and Luke writes this, but these words seemed to them as an idle tale. Jesus had told them time and time again, I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to die, and 3 days and 3 nights later, what's going to happen? I will be back. He told them time and time again. Now the women come after 3 days and after 3 nights, and they say, he has risen. We've seen him. We've touched him. Yeah. That it seemed to them, it says, as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. I read it from the Gospel of Mark this morning, and the disciples are rebuked like 3 times in that chapter for not believing that Jesus had risen from the dead. This wasn't something they concocted, and they went around and they stole the body. Now we can go around and tell everybody exactly what happened and tell our story because they themselves didn't believe it. John apparently believed it right away, but of course he would. He was John, right? Luke tells us about 2 of them who were leaving town. They'd had it, and Jesus kind of hid who he was, and he met him on the road, and he's walking down the road to Emmaus with them, and he said, why do you look so sad? And they're like, where have you been? We thought this Jesus was the answer, and they killed him. This was after he'd raised, and they didn't believe it. And they're walking down the street with him. These are people who had been with him for 3 years. Thomas, what was his nickname? Yeah, that's so mean. Doubting Thomas. I'm sure every time Jesus said, if you have faith, they all looked at Thomas and said, Doubting Thomas. Well, I don't get down on Thomas because Thomas just wanted to know for sure. And after the other disciples had all told him that Jesus was alive, and this is like a week later, and after they had all seen him, and they're saying, Thomas, it's real. Remember what Thomas said? Unless I see him with my own 2 eyes, unless I reach in my hand where they put that spear in his side, unless I touch the holes in his hands, I will not believe that Jesus has raised from the dead. They didn't believe it at first. But something changed. You know what it was? One by one or in groups, they saw and met Jesus alive from the dead, and that changed everything. He was not missing. He was what? Alive. He even ate in front of them. He even let them touch him. He did all kinds of stuff to show that he was real. They saw and met Jesus alive from the dead. Here's something for you. Do you know what the first book written in the New Testament was? Any ideas? James. Way in the back. James is really the first one pen put to paper. Because it was written so early, if you read the book of James, you will still see that there's still a lot of the Jewish nature in that book. Right? So the book of James is written first. Do you know who wrote the book of James? Now, that's a tough question. Okay, there you go. It wasn't a trick question. James. That's why we call it the book of James. James was not one of the 12 disciples. Did you know that? No, James was not. He was the brother of who? Jesus. His own brother. And this is why this is so interesting. I mean, and you might think there, well, no wonder he got to write the first book. He was Jesus' brother. He's going to get a book deal out of this, right? And I'm going to have it out on Amazon. I'm going to self-publish, and I'm just going to get rich doing this. No, it wasn't anything like that. What is really odd about it is that James didn't believe in Jesus. I mean, he believed he existed, but he didn't believe all those things he said and all those things he taught and all those things he did. Jesus' brothers did not believe in him. And you got to give them some understanding there. It is kind of hard to come to grips with the fact that your brother is the creator of the universe and the savior of mankind and God in person. He did struggle with that a bit. And James did not believe until he met Jesus alive from the dead. And that changed everything. After that, after James saw his brother alive from the dead again, and all the evidence is there, you've got all the holes and everything where he'd had the crown of thorns on, and here he is, but he's standing there before me, and he's alive, and he's speaking to me. After that, James became not a leader in the church in Jerusalem, but the leader in the church in Jerusalem. And he wrote the first book in the New Testament. And because of his belief in Jesus now that he had seen the risen Jesus, because of the belief he had in him and his preaching about Jesus, the same scribes and Pharisees that crucified Jesus, they took James up to the highest point in the temple. It's up on that mountain. And they took him up to that highest thing. It's called the pinnacle of the temple. And they threw him off it. And the fall didn't kill him. And they came down and they gathered stones and they smashed him to death with the stones. But he still wasn't dead yet. So a guy who's a fuller, that means he did laundry, he used a club to wash clothes, don't know how it works, but he came down and he finished him off with that. And James believed so much when he had seen his brother risen from the dead that he was everything he said he was, that he was willing to face it all. It changed him. Doesn't that make you wonder something? How does a person go from not believing in Jesus to proclaiming him and to holding on to those claims even through torture and murder? How does that happen? You know how? They had seen Jesus alive from the dead, and it proved to them that everything he said about himself and about God and about their need for salvation, it was all true. It's really what the resurrection is about. He paid the cost of our sin on the cross. The resurrection proves it's true. Because he said, 3 days, 3 nights, I'm back. And he was. By his own power. After the resurrection, Jesus went around showing himself to all of these people after he had risen from the dead. In like I said, in groups and one-on-ones and things like that. Jesus spent about 40 days going around meeting all the people that he had known and showing himself to them alive. In fact, turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 9. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 9. While you're turning to that one, let me share a little bit about this passage. Historians believe widely, and not just Christian historians, okay? These are not just people who write books about the Bible, but historians who evaluate the historicity of events. Historians in general believe that this was originally written by the Apostle Paul within 30 years of the death of Jesus. Many of them also believe that the beginning part of this was kind of sung in the church in those days. It became kind of a hymn. And why that's important is it shows us that the belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ was not something made up years and years later, but was a belief and a tenet of the early church from the very beginning. The church was built, or like we sang this morning, it was born in the belief of Jesus' resurrection. Look at this, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 9. Paul writes this to the Corinthian church and says, "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word that I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures." That means the Old Testament prophesied it, and then it happened. "That he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, also from the Old Testament, and that he appeared to Cephas," which is Peter's other name, "and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James," we just talked about James, "then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." He tells us about the way Jesus went around showing himself to all these people for a period of about 40 days. He mentions himself there, and he even tells of his past. We talked about the cowardice of the other apostles. They were hiding, and all of that. Well, Paul hated this new church. He hated this movement. And you remember what he was doing? Persecuting it. Going to towns with warrants for arrest and arresting people for believing in Jesus and hauling them into torture and prison. That's what the Apostle Paul was doing before he wrote most of the New Testament. He truly hated it. But then guess what? He met Jesus, alive from the dead, on the road to Damascus. And that changed everything. He mentions Peter, as I mentioned, using his other name, Cephas. Do you remember what Peter was doing when they were torturing Jesus before the crucifixion? He was known for doing what? 3 times? Denying Jesus. He was kind of following, he was kind of watching what's going to happen to Jesus. He sneaks in with the crowd and somebody says, "Oh, hey, I know you. You were with him." And he says, "I don't know him." And 3 times that happens. 3 times. And each time he says, "I don't know him," at the end, he's finally, even it says he's cursing and swearing, "I don't know this man." In John chapter 20, verse 19, we see Peter and all the other disciples, it says, hiding away in lockdown in the very same room where they had the Last Supper with Jesus just a few days earlier. They had the doors locked and they're hiding in the dark, afraid somebody's going to find them, John says, for fear of the Jews. They came and got Jesus, and I'm afraid they're coming to get me next. And they were all in hiding. Peter, one of the biggest chickens of all at that point. And yet we see this in Acts chapter 2, verses 20 through 24. Luke, who wrote Acts for us, tells us that Peter stood up before all of Jerusalem just 46 days later, after the resurrection, after the crucifixion, 46 days later, and he says, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wondrous signs that God did through him in your midst. As you yourselves know," you were here, you know this didn't happen in a closet. "This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." This is the man that was hiding a month earlier? And I'm saying, God sent him to you, and what did you do with him? You killed him. Not only killed him, but you gave him the most hideous death you could come up with. You crucified him. But he doesn't stop there, and he says, "But God raised him up, loosing the pains of death, because," I love this phrase, this is the greatest part of his sermon, "because it was not possible," excuse me, "for him to be held by it." See, I get choked up. It's so powerful. Excuse me. It was not possible for him to be held by death. It couldn't do it. We sang that this morning, didn't we? What changed in Peter from hiding behind locked doors to standing on the same street, proclaiming, "You killed him and God raised him"? History tells us that later this same Peter, nothing but a fisherman from Galilee, a nothing from nowhere, stood before Caesar and proclaimed the gospel of Jesus Christ and was crucified for it himself and never backed down. What changed? What changed is that these men and women had all seen the risen Jesus firsthand during that period of time, and there was no way they could deny it. You ever seen something that you can't deny? You can't bring yourself to say it didn't happen because you were there and you saw it? It was not a hallucination. We know that because going back to what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, 500 eyewitnesses saw him at the same time. That has never happened. A mass hallucination like that has never happened. 500 people saw him at one time, and Paul even challenges the reader in that thing we read, and he says, most of whom are still alive. In other words, you know what he's saying there? Go ask them. Go see for yourself. Go hear their story, because there's 500 people over here who saw him alive, and they're happy to tell you about it. Go investigate, which is actually what the book of Luke is. He starts out his book. He said, somebody needed to investigate everything, and I did. So Luke is very trustworthy. We'll be going into the book of Luke next year. But he says, go talk to him. I double dog dare you. Go check into this. So the truth of the matter is, these men and women, the Romans didn't discriminate against women when it came to persecution, torture, and killing for faith in Christ. They were just as happy to murder the women. It was an equal opportunity persecution. They were presented with this irrefutable evidence that Jesus was alive, and they could not deny it, even to the loss of their own lives. He came and stood before them. And they were so convinced of this that they could not, in all good conscience, deny what they had seen. What they were really presented with, this was the option that all these early Christians were given, and all the apostles, they were all given this option: lie or die. Lie or die. Here's your choice. You tell me that this was all made up. You tell me Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. You tell me you stole his body and where you put it. Or we're going to kill you and torture you. That drew them into this unshakable commitment. They could not say that he was alive. How can we lie? How can we tell you this never happened? I saw him. I touched him. That's exactly how the Apostle John starts his letter that he writes, the book of 1 John. In fact, you can turn over there, 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. That's exactly how he starts out his letter when he writes it. I always love John's starting statements, and this one is just fantastic. He says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, the life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testify to it and proclaim to you eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have," I love this, "that which we have seen and heard we proclaim to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son." His whole point is, we saw him, we touched him, we heard him, we were there, and we are passing along to you exactly what we have seen. All they could do to save their lives all they had to do was to lie about it, about what they had seen and heard and touched. And everyone, even the ones interrogating, knew they would be lying. And they couldn't do it to save their own lives. So it changed them. They were not the men and the women that they had been at one time. They had crossed a line that they could never go back on. They had nothing to gain by telling the truth and everything to gain by lying. And you know what is so amazing about it? Not one of them did. Every one of the apostles, every one of these authors, except John, of course, because he's John, every one of them was murdered for what they taught and what they told. Not one recanted. John, he didn't get murdered for it. He just got boiled in oil and poisoned and banished out to an island in the middle of the sea in a penal colony. So he got off easy, right? Not one of them recanted. I just saw a Babylon Bee thing this week. Sometimes they do some really funny things. You can go to I wanted to show it to you, but we don't have time. You can go to my Facebook page, and I posted it there, but it's all the disciples, and they kind of got their Monty Python on for this to do something funny. The Babylon Bee can usually be pretty funny. And it's the 12, they correct it and say, the 11. There's 11 of us now after Jesus was crucified, and Judas had already committed suicide, and the 11 are going around, and Peter stands up and goes, "You know what would be a really funny joke?" And he sounds more Russian than Hebrew to me, but he says, "We should steal the body of Jesus, and we should hide it, and we should tell everybody he's risen from the dead." And they're like, "Oh, that'll be great." And they're jumping up and down. Of course, it's satire, right? That's not what happened. And they're showing the reason. And all the other disciples say, yeah, let's do it. What do we get for doing this? And he says, prison, torture, death. But it will be so fun, They're getting the point across that no one would do this. No one would make this up and face the torment and torture of that just to get nothing for it. And they were changed. If you come to the truth of what happened on that day, it changes you, and it changes the way you see everything, and it changes absolutely everything. And you might say, "But I haven't seen the risen Jesus." So, some would even say, "No, but," or I might even say to you, you say, "I haven't seen the risen Jesus." I can say, "Well, no, but my son has. I know Linda has now. I know many of your husbands or wives that have passed on, or children have seen him. No, we don't get to see him face to face like that. It's kind of like what Jesus said to Thomas when he was doubting. And he said, and finally Jesus came and showed himself to Thomas even in his doubt. And he said, okay, Thomas, here's the hole. There's where the spear went in. It ripped me good. Reach on in there. Here's my hands. And Thomas kind of like, well, I'll pass, I know what I said. What he actually said was he fell on his knees and he said, my Lord and my God. He was the first one to proclaim Jesus as God like that. And then Jesus said to him, well, Thomas, you're blessed because you've seen me. Much more blessed will be those who don't see me and still believe. That's where most of us are with that. I mean, here's the beauty. It's not just what these books say. We have to believe what the disciples wrote and what they left behind for us. That is what these Gospels are, but it's not just what these books say. We know that we can trust them because there's so much supporting outside arguments and articles from the first century, from the same time when these New Testament letters and books were being written about the resurrected Jesus. I know when I was in high school, teachers would try and say, Jesus never lived. Nobody tries to say that anymore. There's too much substantiating historical data that Jesus lived that shows us. And there were writers who backed up the things that we believed. Yes, we don't get to see him, but we can believe in the evidence that was given to us. That it's not just all something that's made up, and some would say that. We have this incredible amount of evidence that lends to the historicity of what we're reading. We have writings of men like Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor who wrote about the Christians and wrote to Emperor Trajan asking for help in dealing with these Christians. And he did this just after these books were written. We have men like Josephus. He was a Jewish man working for Rome. He must have been popular at home. Chronicling the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 when they razed it to the ground, the Romans did. And he writes about Jesus. He even stated he did miracles and that they crucified him. It's not just that we're trusting these books that a bunch of people made up. One of the greatest ones is Tacitus, a Roman historian, not a believer. Again, none of these men are believers. And at the same time, just after all this happens, he writes Christus, from whom the name had its origin, or why we're called Christians, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. He backs up just what was said in the New Testament. These were all within 20 to 30 years of the crucifixion happening. That's like us remembering things that happened in the 1990s. Most of us can remember the 1990s. Not many people remember the 60s, but that was a different generation, But the 1990s we can remember. These are not things that happened in some faraway made-up place. We have all kinds of historical evidence of their truth. The Jews themselves recorded what happened to Jesus. Did you know that? They wrote it down. It's in the Talmud. It says on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." That's recorded in Israel's history. You can believe it. We don't get to see him face to face yet. But we have all this that he has given us so we can believe and trust in him. I'd love to jump into some heavy-duty apologetics right now, but your ham's going to get cold or burn if it's in the oven. But I want to share this one with you to show how authentic these writings that we're trusting in are. I love this, that not that long ago, a fragment of the book of Mark was found inside the sarcophagus of an Egyptian mummy in Alexandria. And the Egyptian mummy dates back to the 1st century. Probably to between 60 and 90 AD. There are some of the historians that have looked at this document, and it's not some out-of-the-way, fake news thing. This is from the Smithsonian. And this fragment may have even been copied while Mark was still alive. In the time that they were living, these stories were passed around, and the books that they had say the same thing as the book we have. It's been scrutinized for 2,000 years, and it still holds true. And we know these things were written by them. We have all this archaeological evidence that shows us these are real. It just excites me so. Here's a piece of the book of Mark from within 30 years of when it happened. And maybe Mark was still alive. It was in Alexandria, Egypt, which is where the greatest library of the ancient times was. And somebody had this. They either wanted to preserve it or they were using it as scrap paper or something like that. And they put it in this mummy sarcophagus, and we have it today, preserved for us. The reason that's important is because people will tell you that maybe 100 years later, 200 years later, people started making up stories about Jesus. We see from all these things, all these historians in his time were writing, he did these miracles, he did these things. We even have the Gospel of Mark from then. Mark was so convinced that these things were true, and that's what it shows us. We at least know they believed it was true, that as he was preaching the gospel in Alexandria, it is interesting that that's where that fragment was found. Because of his teaching that Jesus was God, they grabbed him and they dragged him through the streets behind horses for 2 days until he died. And he never recanted his story. He could die or go free or hold to the truth. He could hold to the truth or be brutally tortured over a period of 2 days and finally die. No one would die for a lie like that. He'd been changed. He was convinced. He was committed. Now he was changed. That Jesus lived, was crucified, and that he was raised from the dead is as much history as any history that we have, and documented more. And if the historical records are true, as I 100% believe they are, he said, I'm going to be betrayed, arrested, and crucified, and will rise again 3 days and 3 nights later. And he did just that. And if that's what happened, you have to take serious and make an honest assessment of who he really was. No one but God could ever do that. You can choose not to believe that, but let me tell you, that's a high-stakes bet. When you consider the things that Jesus said, like, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except how? Through me. That's a tall claim. And you can choose to disbelieve him, but listen, this is what he said. The same man who said, I'm going to be killed and I will be raised from the dead 3 days later. Jesus also said this, whoever believes in him, that's me, he might have said me at that time, but he was speaking kind of second person about himself, is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. That's what Jesus said, the same man. Those are some pretty strong claims, aren't they? And by raising from the dead, he has proven that everything he said was true. The glory of his resurrection is indescribable. The impact of his resurrection is undeniable. Here we are 2,000 years later, and all across the world today, in probably every language and every people group in every city, there is somebody celebrating, over 1 billion people today celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. A man who probably never traveled more than 100 miles from home, never wrote a book himself, never had a throne, never had an army. And 2,000 years later, we're all still celebrating it. What really matters, though, isn't the impact on the world, it's the impact it has on you. Are you convinced? If not, I hope you will do some real digging firsthand, and I don't mean just Googling a few things or getting on ChatGPT and asking what it thinks about it. Please don't do that. But actual digging and doing the diligence of finding out the truth for yourself, because there is so much at stake. I would love to dialogue with anybody about it, because there's so much I just would love to share and don't have time. Are you convinced? If you are convinced, I hope you're committed. Not to just take it today and turn away from it tomorrow when we see how these men who really, really, truly believe it did. You know, if you are those things, if you are convinced and you are committed and you let it have its way with you, I tell you, it will change you for the better.